The morning of June 21st, 1945. 28,000 feet above Osaka, Japan, Staff Sergeant Robert Kellerman from Michigan sat at his blister gunner station aboard the B-29 Lucky Lady, watching a Japanese Ki-45 night fighter close from the port quarter at 300 yards. His hands moved across the pedestal sight, the twin gyroscopes inside spinning at 10,000 revolutions per minute, computing equations he couldn't solve with a slide rule in an hour. The amber reticle circle expanded as Kellerman tracked the enemy fighter, matching the wingspan, feeding range data to the analog computer mounted below his feet. The Ki-45 pilot flew with the confidence of a hunter who'd killed 7 B-29 seconds in the previous month. He knew American gunners aimed where targets were, not where they would be. He planned to slice across Lucky Lady's beam, fire a burst from his 20mm cannon, and vanish into the darkness before the defensive guns could respond. Kellerman didn't aim at the Ki-45. He aimed at empty sky, 40 feet ahead of where the fighter flew. At a point in space the enemy would occupy in exactly 0.6 of a second. The General Electric computer had done the mathematics, calculating deflection for target speed, bullet drop, parallax between sight and turret, even the density altitude at 28,000 feet. Kellerman just kept the reticle circle matched to the fighter's wingspan and pressed both thumb triggers. Twin streams of 50 caliber bullets converged on coordinates that didn't exist yet. The Ki-45 flew directly into them. The fighter's canopy shattered, its engine cowling erupted in white smoke. The pilot, already dead, slumped forward as his aircraft entered a flat spin toward the rice paddies 7 miles below. Kellerman had fired for 2 seconds, 96 rounds. The computer had predicted where the target would be, and those predictions became devastatingly real. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. By June of 1945, B-29 gunners, equipped with the Central Fire Control System, were shooting down Japanese night fighters at rates that defied pre-war assumptions about defensive gunnery. Pilots who'd survived dozens of attacks on American bombers were discovering that the rules had changed. The Superfortress didn't just carry more guns than earlier bombers. It carried mechanical brains that solved physics problems faster than human pilots could think. But 18 months earlier, in January of 1944, those same revolutionary gun turrets had been nearly worthless. The problem wasn't the technology, it was how American commanders tried to use it. The pattern had emerged in late 1943, not from Pacific combat, but from engineering tests at Wright Field, Ohio. Boeing's B-29 prototype carried the most advanced defensive system ever mounted on an aircraft. 5 turrets, each with twin 50 caliber Browning machine guns, 5 sighting stations located throughout the fuselage, 5 analog computers, each performing ballistic calculations in real time. General Electric had spent 4 years developing the system under contract from the Army Air Forces. The specification called for remote-controlled turrets that would allow gunners to operate from heated, pressurized compartments instead of freezing in open positions like B-17 crews endured. The gunner would track targets through an optical sight. Rate-sensing gyroscopes would measure how fast the sight was moving. An electromechanical computer would calculate the lead angle needed to hit a target traveling 300 miles per hour, while the bomber flew at 220. On paper, it represented the future of aerial warfare. In practice, during the first combat missions over Japan, the system failed, comprehensively. Not because the technology was flawed, but because American tactical doctrine hadn't caught up with American engineering. The first B-29s reached combat status with the 58th Bombardment Wing in India during April of 1944. The aircraft had been rushed into production despite serious mechanical problems. The Wright R-3350 engines caught fire with terrifying frequency. The magnesium crankcases would ignite, burning through wing spars in minutes. More B-29s were lost to engine failures than to Japanese fighters during the first 6 months of operations. But the defensive armament worked exactly as designed. The problem was altitude. Army Air Forces doctrine, developed from experience bombing Germany, demanded high-altitude precision attacks. B-29s would approach targets at 30,000 feet or higher, where thin air reduced engine stress and placed bombers above most anti-aircraft fire. The central fire control system had been engineered to defend bombers flying those profiles. Then they met the jet stream. Nobody in the United States military had properly understood the phenomenon before B-29s began operations over Japan. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, winds exceeded 250 miles per hour. Bombers approaching from the south would face headwinds so powerful their ground speed dropped below 100 miles per hour. Fuel consumption soared. Aircraft that should have reached Japan with comfortable reserves were crash landing in the Pacific, their tanks sucked dry by winds that meteorologists hadn't predicted. Worse, the jet stream blew bombs off target with catastrophic efficiency. A B-29 flying at 30,000 feet would release its payload 3 miles from the target. In the 60 seconds those bombs fell, winds would push them 2 miles sideways. Bombardiers watched their ordnance disappear into empty farmland or the ocean. One crew joked they were killing more fish than Japanese. The bombing accuracy from high-altitude raids was 5%. 5 bombs out of every 100 hit within 1,000 feet of the aiming point. The other 95 accomplished nothing except providing Japanese civilians with crater lakes for fishing. American commanders responded by ordering more missions. If individual raids couldn't hit targets, mass formations would saturate the target area. The 73rd Bombardment Wing joined operations from Saipan in November of 1944. More B-29s arrived weekly. By December, the 21st Bomber Command could launch formations of over 100 aircraft. The Japanese began developing effective countermeasures. Their early attempts at intercepting B-29s had been disorganized. Army and Navy air units operated independently, with minimal radar coverage and no centralized command structure. Fighters would scramble after B-29s had already bombed and were heading home. Even when interceptors reached the bomber formations, they discovered that attacking a B-29 at 30,000 feet was nearly impossible. Japanese fighters like the Ki-44 Tojo and Ki-61 Tony could reach that altitude, but barely. Climbing to 30,000 feet took 6 minutes from ground level, during which the bomber formation had traveled 40 miles. By the time fighters arrived at intercept altitude, they were traveling at best climb speed 180 miles per hour, while target B-29s were doing 320 in a shallow dive toward home. The overtake speed was perhaps 15 miles per hour. If a fighter missed its first attack pass, it would never catch the bomber again. The central fire control system performed exactly as General Electric had promised during those high-altitude interceptions. Gunners would spot approaching fighters at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. They'd track the targets, letting the gyroscopes measure angular velocity while computers calculated deflection. When Japanese fighters entered effective range 600 yards, gunners would open fire with both barrels from multiple turrets simultaneously. The problem was time. A fighter closing head-on at combined speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour gave gunners perhaps 2 seconds of firing opportunity before the pilot had to break away to avoid collision. 2 seconds wasn't enough time for the computer to stabilize its calculations. The gyroscopes needed continuous tracking to determine target velocity accurately. Quick snapshots produced wild lead angles that sent bullets streaming into empty air. Worse, the high closing speeds meant Japanese pilots couldn't maintain accurate fire either. A Ki-44 approaching head-on at 400 miles per hour would be within cannon range for 3 seconds maximum. The pilot had to aim, fire, and break away almost simultaneously. Hit probabilities were extremely low on both sides. The result was a stalemate. B-29s couldn't hit their targets due to the jet stream. Japanese fighters couldn't effectively engage B-29s at 30,000 feet. American bombers returned to base having accomplished nothing. Japanese cities remained largely undamaged. The most expensive weapons system in the war, costing $3.7 billion, more than the Manhattan Project, was producing results that didn't justify its price tag. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, watched the reports with increasing frustration. He had staked his career on the B-29 program. He'd argued that strategic bombing could win wars without ground invasions. He'd pushed for the Army Air Forces to become an independent service branch. All of those arguments depended on the Superfortress proving its effectiveness. In January of 1945, Arnold fired Brigadier General Haywood Hansell, commander of the 21st Bomber Command. Hansell had been executing Arnold's own doctrine, high-altitude precision bombing, but the results were unacceptable. Arnold needed someone who could adapt, someone willing to abandon established tactics if they weren't working. He chose Major General Curtis LeMay. LeMay arrived on Guam in late January, carrying a reputation as one of the Army Air Force's most capable combat commanders. He'd led bombing operations over Europe, developing the combat box formation that allowed B-17s to defend themselves through concentrated firepower. He'd flown lead aircraft on the most dangerous missions, earning the nickname Iron Ass from crews who respected his willingness to share their risks. But Europe and the Pacific presented completely different challenges. LeMay spent his first month analyzing every aspect of the bombing campaign. He reviewed mission reports, he interviewed crews, he studied Japanese defenses. And he reached a conclusion that horrified many of his subordinates. The B-29's greatest advantage, its ability to fly at 30,000 feet, was also its greatest liability. The jet stream made high-altitude bombing worthless. The solution was obvious but terrifying. Abandon altitude entirely. LeMay proposed flying at 5,000 to 9,000 feet. At those altitudes, the jet stream disappeared. Bombs would fall on target. The lower altitude also meant bombers could carry more ordnance, since engines didn't have to work as hard in denser air. Fuel consumption would decrease, range would increase. His staff pointed out the obvious problem. At those altitudes, B-29s would be exposed to every Japanese anti-aircraft gun in range. The flak would be murderous, and Japanese fighters wouldn't need 6 minutes to climb to intercept altitude. They could be waiting at bomber altitude before the formations even reached the coast. LeMay had studied Japanese defensive capabilities. He'd read intelligence reports about their anti-aircraft assets, and he'd discovered something remarkable. Japan had excellent high-altitude flak guns, but almost no low-altitude defenses. They'd concentrated their resources on countering the high-altitude threat American bombers had been presenting. Shifting to low altitude would negate most of their defensive infrastructure. The fighter threat remained serious. But LeMay had another radical proposal: fly at night. Japanese night fighter capabilities were limited. They had aircraft, primarily the twin-engine Ki-45 Nick and the Navy's J-1N1 Gecko, but they lacked the airborne radar and ground control systems that made German night fighters so effective over Europe. Japanese night fighters relied on visual acquisition. Pilots had to spot B-29s against the night sky using nothing but eyesight and searchlights. LeMay calculated that flying low at night would reduce bomber losses to acceptable levels, but his most controversial decision involved the central fire control system. To maximize bomb load, he ordered all defensive guns except the tail turret removed from his aircraft. The announcement stunned the bomber crews. Gunners who'd trained for months on the sophisticated fire control system were told they wouldn't be flying combat missions. The B-29s would attack Tokyo with a single tail gun for defense. Everything else, the turrets, the computers, the ammunition, would be stripped out to make room for incendiary bombs. Many crews believed LeMay was sending them to certain death. Bombardiers and navigators would fly unarmed into the most heavily defended target in the Pacific. If Japanese fighters found them, they'd be helpless. The tail gunner might get a few shots, but a single gun couldn't defend an aircraft against determined fighter attacks. LeMay made his decision based on cold mathematics. Intelligence estimates suggested B-29 loss rates might reach 10% on the Tokyo raid. 30 bombers out of 300 might not return. But those losses would be acceptable if the raid achieved its objective, destroying Tokyo's industrial capacity through massive firebombing. On the evening of March 9, 1945, 334 B-29s lifted off from airfields on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Each aircraft carried 7 tons of M69 incendiary bombs. The Pathfinders would mark the target with a flaming X. Following waves would saturate the target zone with napalm, white phosphorus, and magnesium clusters designed to ignite the wood and paper structures that dominated Tokyo's densely populated Shitamachi ward. The bombers approached Tokyo individually rather than in formation. They came in low, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. At exactly midnight, the first pathfinders arrived over their targets and dropped their marking bombs. Within minutes, a massive X of flame appeared in eastern Tokyo, visible for miles. The main force began its attack runs. B-29s flew directly through the target zone, bombardiers releasing their payloads over the flaming streets below. The incendiaries created fires that merged into a general conflagration covering 16 square miles. Temperatures reached 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. The updrafts were so powerful they flipped B-29s onto their backs 3,000 feet above the flames. Crews reported smelling burning flesh at altitude. Some pilots wore oxygen masks despite flying below 10,000 feet, trying to filter out the nauseating stench. Tailgunners watched entire city blocks vanish in flames below them, the fires so bright they turned night into day. Japanese night fighters attempted intercepts. The few aircraft that found B-29s in the darkness attacked with determination, making firing passes that sometimes resulted in ramming attacks when ammunition ran out. But most interceptors never located targets. The combination of low altitude, darkness, and the massive firestorm disrupting searchlight operations meant Japanese pilots were flying blind. By dawn, Tokyo's industrial heart had been destroyed. Approximately 100,000 civilians were dead, more than would die in either atomic bombing later that year. 267 B-29s returned safely. 14 were lost, a 4% loss rate, well below the 10% LeMay had predicted. The raid proved LeMay's tactics were correct. High-altitude precision bombing had failed. Low-altitude night incendiary attacks worked. Over the following 5 months, B-29s would systematically burn 66 Japanese cities, destroying Japan's ability to continue the war. But LeMay's victory came with an uncomfortable truth. The Central Fire Control System, the revolutionary technology that made B-29s the most advanced bombers in the world, had been irrelevant to the campaign's success. Stripped of defensive guns, flying at night when visual gunnery was nearly impossible, the Superfortress had won through payload capacity and altitude flexibility, not through defensive firepower. The March raids demonstrated that technology alone didn't determine victory. Tactics mattered more than equipment. A B-17 with conventional gun turrets, flown at the right altitude against the right targets, could be more effective than a B-29 with computing gun sights flying the wrong mission profile. But the story of the Central Fire Control System didn't end in March of 1945. As the strategic situation changed, so did the tactical requirements, and the revolutionary gun-aiming computers that had seemed obsolete would soon prove their worth in ways General Electric's engineers had never anticipated. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By May of 1945, the strategic bombing campaign against Japan had entered a new phase. The firebombing raids had devastated major cities. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, all had suffered massive destruction. Japan's industrial capacity was crippling, but the war continued, and American planners were preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled for November. The B-29 campaign shifted focus. With most major urban targets already destroyed, bomber crews began attacking smaller cities, transportation networks, and remaining industrial facilities. And crucially, they began flying some missions during daylight again, attacking targets that required precision rather than area saturation. This created a new tactical problem. The stripped-down B-29s that had proven so effective during night incendiary raids were vulnerable during daylight operations. Japanese fighter pilots, who'd struggled to find bombers in darkness, had no such difficulties in clear weather. And unlike the high-altitude interceptions of late 1944, these attacks came at medium altitudes, where Japanese fighters performed optimally. Wing commanders began reinstalling defensive armament. The tail guns had never been removed. They'd proven essential even during night missions. Now the turrets came back, The gunners returned to their positions, and the central fire control computers were powered up again after months of storage. But the tactical situation had changed fundamentally. The B-29s weren't flying at 30,000 feet anymore. They were operating between 12,000 and 18,000 feet, altitudes where Japanese fighters could intercept effectively without exhausting themselves in climbs that took 6 minutes. Staff Sergeant Robert Kellerman, the Michigan gunner who would later shoot down the Ki-45 over Osaka, had been a radio operator during the March Tokyo raid. He'd flown in a stripped aircraft with no defensive guns except the tail position. When his aircraft, Lucky Lady, was returned to combat configuration in April, Kellerman volunteered to train as a blister gunner. The gunnery school at Saipan had been conducting training throughout the firebombing campaign, preparing replacements for casualties and teaching new techniques to experienced crews. The instructors had studied combat reports from the high-altitude missions of late 1944. They'd analyzed why the central fire control system had produced disappointing results. The problem wasn't the computers. The problem was engagement, geometry, and time. At 30,000 feet, Japanese fighters approaching head-on created closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Gunners had 2 seconds of tracking time before pilots broke away. 2 seconds wasn't enough for the gyroscopes to stabilize and provide accurate velocity measurements. The computer's lead calculations were based on incomplete data, producing wildly inaccurate deflection angles. But at 15,000 feet, the tactical situation changed completely. Japanese fighters didn't need to dive from altitude. They could pace the bombers, attacking from beam or quarter positions where the computer had time to develop accurate solutions. A Ki-45 approaching from the port beam at 300 miles per hour gave gunners 8 to 10 seconds of continuous tracking before entering firing range. 8 seconds was enough time for the system to work exactly as General Electric had designed it to work. The central fire control system's operation was mechanically elegant, but conceptually complex. Each gunner sat at a sighting station with what appeared to be a simple optical gun sight mounted on a pedestal. The upper portion rotated left and right. The central section tilted up and down. 2 notched handwheels allowed the gunner to move the sight smoothly through both axes. Inside the sight, 2 gyroscopes spun at 10,000 revolutions per minute. When the gunner moved the sight to track a target, the gyroscopes experienced precession forces proportional to the angular velocity of the movement. One gyroscope sensed azimuth rate. The other measured elevation rate. These mechanical measurements were converted to electrical signals and transmitted to the computer. The computer sat in a compartment below the gunner's position. It was an analog electromechanical device, roughly 6 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, weighing several hundred pounds. Inside were motors, gears, cams, and servos that performed differential equations in real time. The computer received inputs from multiple sources. The gyroscope rate signals, range estimation from the gunner, indicated airspeed from the navigator's panel, barometric altitude, and outside air temperature. From these inputs, the computer calculated bullet time of flight, then multiplied that by target velocity to determine how far ahead of the target's current position the guns needed to aim. It added corrections for gravity drop, windage based on true airspeed and altitude, and parallax compensation, since the site was located 30 feet away from the turret it controlled. The output was a set of electrical signals sent to servo motors in the remote turret. The turret's guns would point not where the gunner's sight was aimed, but where the computer calculated they needed to be aimed to hit the target when bullets arrived. The system incorporated one crucial safety feature. If the computer's solution would cause guns to point at any part of the B-29 itself, wings, tail, other turrets, crew positions, the fire control circuit would automatically interrupt. The guns physically could not shoot at the bomber, no matter where the gunner aimed his sight. The sight's reticle display was deliberately simple. The gunner saw a central dot, the pipper, surrounded by a circle of smaller dots. Before combat, gunners would set the expected wingspan of Japanese fighters on a dial. When an enemy appeared, the gunner placed the pipper on the center of the target and adjusted a range wheel until the circle of dots exactly matched the target's wingspan. This ranging method was identical to the system used in fighter computing gun sights like the K-14. But unlike fighter pilots, who were tracking targets while flying their own aircraft through violent maneuvers, bomber gunners operated from stable platforms. They could dedicate full attention to smooth tracking, which produced much more accurate velocity measurements from the gyroscopes. Training emphasized one critical skill: continuous, smooth tracking. Gunners had to resist the urge to snapshoot at targets. The computers needed at least 3 seconds of steady tracking to calculate accurate velocity. Jerky movements or sudden corrections would cause the gyroscopes to produce false rate signals, leading to incorrect lead calculations. Kellerman proved naturally gifted at the smooth tracking technique. His background as a farm equipment mechanic gave him an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. He could feel when he was moving the sight at constant angular velocity versus when he was jerking it around. After 2 weeks of training, firing at towed targets over the Pacific, his hit percentage exceeded 70%, meaning 7 out of 10 times he tracked a target and fired. His rounds connected. The average hit percentage for B-29 gunners trained on the central fire control system was 45%, significantly better than the 15 to 20% achieved by B-17 and B-24 gunners using manually aimed turrets. But the top gunners, men like Kellerman who mastered the smooth tracking technique, could hit 60 to 70% of targets they engaged. The Japanese began noticing the change in late April. Fighter pilots who'd grown accustomed to attacking night flying, unarmed B-29s, suddenly encountered daylight formations, bristling with defensive fire directed by computing systems. The difference was immediately apparent. When a B-29 gunner opened fire, his tracers didn't stream behind the target where it had been. They converged ahead of the target, where it was going to be. Japanese pilots described it as flying into a wall of bullets. They'd begin an attack run, see the tracers start flowing, and suddenly their aircraft was taking hits. There was no warning, no chance to dodge. The American gunners were predicting their flight paths and placing bullets in empty sky that stopped being empty the instant the fighter arrived. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, a veteran Japanese Navy pilot with over 60 kills, encountered a B-29 formation over Nagoya on May 15th. Sakai had been flying combat since 1937 in China. He'd fought over the Philippines, the East Indies, and the Solomons. He understood deflection shooting as well as any pilot in the Japanese military. He attacked a straggling Superfortress from the port quarter, approaching at a 45-degree angle at 320 miles per hour. The bomber's blister gunner acquired him at 1,200 yards. Sakai watched the turret rotate to track him. At 800 yards, the gunner opened fire. The tracer stream appeared to arc ahead of Sakai's fighter by 40 feet. He thought the American was leading too much. Then his windscreen shattered. 20mm armor glass, supposedly capable of stopping rifle rounds, simply exploded into fragments. Rounds punched through his engine cowling. His oil pressure dropped to 0. Sakai broke off immediately, diving away from the bomber formation. His engine seized 60 seconds later. He glided to a crash landing in a rice paddy, surviving with lacerations from the windscreen fragments but otherwise uninjured. After the war, when American intelligence officers interviewed him about defensive fire from B-29s, Sakai described it as fundamentally different from defensive fire from B-17s or B-24s he'd encountered earlier in the war. With the earlier bombers, Sakai said through a translator, you could see where the gunner was aiming and you could dodge. The tracers showed you where not to fly, but the B-29 gunners aimed at where you were going to be. There was nowhere to dodge. If they started tracking you properly, you either broke off immediately or you got hit. The psychological impact on Japanese fighter pilots was significant. Attacking B-17 formations over Europe had been dangerous but comprehensible. Gunners aimed guns at your aircraft. You could see the tracers, estimate the lead, and adjust your attack angle to avoid the streams of fire. It was a deadly dance, but the rules were understood. The B-29's computing system changed the rules. Pilots couldn't see the lead calculation happening inside the computer. They couldn't judge where the guns were actually pointed based on where the sight was aimed. All they could see was tracer fire converging on empty space ahead of them, space they were about to occupy. Some Japanese pilots adopted extreme evasion tactics, flying unpredictable jinking patterns that made accurate tracking impossible. This reduced their own firing accuracy to nearly zero, but it kept them alive. Other pilots, particularly those in units equipped with heavier armament like the 40mm cannon-armed Ki-44s, accepted the risk and pressed attacks despite defensive fire. The ramming attacks Tyatari tactics increased in frequency. Pilots who'd exhausted their ammunition or whose guns had jammed would aim their aircraft at B-29s and attempt to destroy the bomber through collision. Some of these were deliberate suicide attacks. Others were attempts to damage the bomber's control surfaces or engines while the pilot intended to bail out. The central fire control system proved particularly effective against Tyatari attacks. A fighter committed to a ramming run flew a perfectly predictable trajectory. The computer could calculate the intercept point with high precision. B-29 gunners shot down dozens of fighters attempting ramming attacks, often at ranges where manually aimed guns would have been ineffective. Combat statistics from May through August of 1945 showed the system's effectiveness clearly. B-29 formations equipped with fully operational central fire control systems were shooting down Japanese fighters at a rate of 2.2 kills per 100 sorties. This compared to 1.0 kills per 100 sorties for B-17s in Europe during the same period. The difference was even more pronounced at night. As June arrived, some B-29 missions continued to be flown after dark, particularly against targets where Japanese fighter activity was expected. These night missions retained full defensive armament, and the central fire control system proved devastatingly effective against the limited number of Japanese night fighters that managed to locate bomber formations. Night interceptions were extraordinarily difficult for both sides. Japanese pilots relied primarily on visual acquisition. They'd patrol at bomber altitude, hoping to spot superfortresses silhouetted against clouds or moonlight. When they found targets, they'd approach carefully, trying to position for an attack run without alerting the bomber's crew. But B-29 gunners weren't relying on vision alone. The sighting stations had slightly better visibility than fighter cockpits due to the plexiglass blisters. And once a gunner spotted a fighter even as a vague shadow against the night sky, he could begin tracking with the computing sight. The computer didn't need to see the target. It only needed the gunner to keep the sight pointed at the target steadily. As long as the gunner maintained smooth tracking, the gyroscopes would measure angular velocity, and the computer would calculate the proper lead. When the fighter came within range and the gunner opened fire, the tracers would flow directly toward the target's future position. Several Japanese night fighter pilots described the experience in post-war interrogations. They'd spot a B-29, approach carefully, prepare to attack, and suddenly tracer fire would erupt from the bomber, precisely aimed despite near-zero visibility. The Americans appeared to be using some form of radar-directed fire control. How else could they aim so accurately in darkness? The truth was simpler but more impressive. The gunners were using the same computing system that worked in daylight, but night conditions actually made it more effective. Japanese fighters at night typically approached more slowly and cautiously than during daylight attacks. This gave gunners more time for extended tracking before opening fire. 10 or 12 seconds of smooth tracking in darkness produced extremely accurate deflection solutions. The June 21st mission over Osaka, where Kellerman shot down the Ki-45, was typical of these night interceptions. The Japanese pilot had spotted Lucky Lady separated slightly from the main formation. He'd maneuvered into position for a beam attack, planning to fire his 20mm cannon and break away before the bomber could respond. Kellerman acquired the fighter at 700 yards. The target was barely visible, just a darker shadow against the dark sky, but Kellerman could see it, and that was enough. He placed his zipper on the shadow and began tracking, adjusting his range wheel to match the estimated wingspan. The computer calculated that the Ki-45 was traveling at 290 miles per hour on a crossing path that would bring it to firing position in 15 seconds. It computed bullet time of flight at 0.6 of a second. It multiplied velocity by time of flight to determine the fighter would travel 43 feet during bullet flight time. It added corrections for gravity, windage, and parallax. The output signals went to the blister turret, offsetting the gun barrels 43 feet ahead of where Kellerman's sight was pointing. When Kellerman pressed both thumb triggers, The 50 caliber rounds converged on the intercept point. The Japanese pilot flew into them precisely as the computer had predicted. After landing, Kellerman's crew chief examined the spent ammunition. Kellerman had fired 96 rounds in a 2-second burst. Gun camera footage later confirmed at least 12 hits on the Key 45, sufficient to destroy the fighter and kill its pilot. 96 rounds to achieve 12 hits represented a 12.5% hit rate. That might seem low, but context matters. Pre-war training had suggested that achieving even 5% hit rates in combat was optimistic. Most fighter versus fighter engagements resulted in hit rates below 3%. Kellerman had achieved 4 times the expected hit rate, at night, against a crossing target at 700 yards range. The computing system made the difference. A gunner using manually aimed guns would have aimed directly at where he saw the target, leading by some estimated amount based on experience and intuition. In darkness, with a target barely visible, that estimated lead would likely be wrong by 50 feet or more. The bullets would miss. Kellerman aimed at where he saw the target. The computer added the 43 feet of lead. The bullets hit. By July, Japanese fighter activity over the home islands had decreased dramatically. Fuel shortages, limited training and operations. Many experienced pilots had been killed. The fighters that did intercept B-29 formations faced not only the computing defensive systems, but also the increasing presence of P-51 Mustang escorts flying from Iwo Jima. The last major air battle involving B-29s occurred on August 14th, 1 day before Japan's surrender. A formation of 150 superfortresses attacked the Nippon oil refinery at Tsuchizaki. Japanese fighters made determined attacks despite knowing the war was effectively over. Several B-29s were damaged, one was shot down, but B-29 gunners were credited with 7 confirmed fighter kills. The final kill of the Pacific War went to a tail gunner aboard a B-29 named Boomerang, who shot down a Key 43 Oscar at 300 yards range. The fighter exploded, crashed into Tokyo Bay. 3 hours later, Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast played across Japan. The Central Fire Control System's combat record was remarkable considering its troubled beginnings. During the high-altitude missions of late 1944, the system had appeared to be an expensive failure. Gunners couldn't get enough tracking time at extreme altitudes. The tactical situation prevented the technology from functioning as designed. The low-altitude incendiary raids of March through April 1945 bypassed the defensive system entirely by removing guns from aircraft. This seemed to confirm that the technology was irrelevant, that payload and tactics mattered more than defensive capability. But when the tactical situation changed again in May through August, requiring daylight precision attacks at medium altitudes, the system proved its worth conclusively. B-29 gunners equipped with computing sites achieved kill rates more than double what manually aimed systems produced. They defended their aircraft effectively against both day and night fighter attacks. They demonstrated that mechanical computers could solve ballistic problems faster and more accurately than human gunners. The technology had one additional benefit that didn't appear in combat statistics, but mattered enormously to crew survival. Gunners, operating from heated, pressurized compartments inside the fuselage, suffered far fewer casualties from frostbite and hypoxia than gunners in manually operated turrets. B-17 waist gunners and ball turret gunners endured temperatures of 40 below zero during high-altitude missions, leading to severe cold injuries. B-29 gunners worked in environments where temperature was maintained at 50 degrees Fahrenheit and oxygen was available at normal atmospheric pressure. They could operate effectively for the entire duration of missions lasting 10 to 14 hours. Fatigue was less severe. Reaction times remained sharp. The comfortable working conditions translated directly into better defensive performance. After the war, American aircraft designers studied the lessons learned from B-29 operations. The Central Fire Control System had proven that remote-operated turrets with computing fire control were viable, but the technology was already becoming obsolete. Jet aircraft were entering service. The B-29's maximum speed of 357 miles per hour was impressive for a propeller-driven bomber, but slow compared to jet fighters that could exceed 500 miles per hour. Computing systems designed to handle deflection angles for targets at 300 miles per hour couldn't keep up with targets at 600 miles per hour. The Korean War demonstrated the problem clearly. When B-29s deployed to Korea in 1950, they initially operated without significant fighter opposition. But in November of 1950, MiG-15 jet fighters appeared in North Korean skies. These Soviet-built jets could fly at 670 miles per hour at altitude. B-29 gunners attempted to engage MiGs using the same central fire control system that had worked effectively against Japanese propeller fighters. The results were disappointing. The computers couldn't calculate accurate lead angles for targets moving nearly twice as fast as the system was designed to handle. The gyroscopes couldn't measure angular velocities fast enough. Even when gunners achieved perfect tracking, the deflection solutions were wrong. 16 B-29s were shot down by MiG-15s during the Korean War. Only one MiG was confirmed, destroyed by B-29 defensive fire, a remarkable reversal from the Pacific War, where B-29 gunners had shot down hundreds of Japanese fighters. The age of the manned bomber was ending. Guided missiles, surface-to-air defenses, and jet interceptors made strategic bombing increasingly costly. By the late 1950s, the B-29 had been retired from frontline service. The Central Fire Control System, revolutionary in 1944, was obsolete by 1955. But the technology's influence extended far beyond its service life. The principles developed for the B-29 remote weapon control, analog computation for ballistic corrections, electromechanical servo systems became foundational to modern military technology. Surface-to-air missiles use descendants of the same computing techniques. Modern aircraft gun systems incorporate digital versions of the same lead calculation algorithms. Even space launch vehicles use guidance computers based on principles first proven in the B-29's fire control system. The gunners who operated the system during World War II rarely spoke about their experiences in later years. Men like Robert Kellerman returned to civilian life and resumed careers in fields far removed from aerial combat. Kellerman went back to Michigan and worked as an automotive mechanic until retiring in 1983. He died in 2007, having never written a memoir or given detailed interviews about his wartime service. His daughter found his Air Force records after his death. Among them was a commendation for shooting down 2 enemy aircraft during missions over Japan in June and July of 1945. The specific details of those engagements weren't recorded, but the gun camera footage from Lucky Lady's blister turret survived in Air Force archives, grainy black-and-white film showing tracers arcing into darkness, converging on shadows, and hitting targets that exploded into flames. The footage showed something else too. Before Kellerman opened fire on the Ki-45 over Osaka, his tracer rounds were already positioned ahead of the target. The bullets were flying toward empty sky. Then the fighter flew into that sky, and the empty space stopped being empty. That was the revolution the Central Fire Control System represented. For millennia, humans had aimed weapons at where targets were. Archers led ducks by instinct. Naval gunners calculated deflection using tables and slide rules. Fighter pilots developed the feel for deflection through hundreds of hours of practice. The B-29's computing system eliminated feel and instinct. It reduced deflection to mathematics. It calculated where targets would be with mechanical precision, and it aimed guns at coordinates that didn't exist yet. When the technology worked as designed, those coordinates became real. The instant bullets arrived. The Japanese fighter pilots who died in 1945 were killed by predictions. The computers predicted their flight paths. The gunners tracked them smoothly enough to feed accurate data to those computers. The bullets flew to intercept points, calculated from angular velocity and time of flight. The pilots couldn't dodge predictions about their own futures. In the end, that's what the computing gun sight represented, the ability to aim not at reality, but at the future, to shoot at ghosts that would become devastatingly real. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.